How long, O Lord?
When will this suffering end?
How long will this pain last?
When will I find your comfort?
Relief?
Healing.
Will I have to wait much longer?
How much longer?
When our children were younger, we spent a lot of time in the car. We had a 2005 Honda Odyssey minivan. It was our minivan era, and we put a lot of miles on that machine. And the girls spent a lot of time in there. Sometimes they would try to take over and mimic the way that their mother was. This is Danica trying to drive at a little bit too early, before 16 years old. But most of the time, the girls were in the back, donning their very stylish sunglasses. And it didn't matter whether we were going to Costco or we were going to the church or whether we were driving to Grandmom and Granddad's house that was about 200 miles away. After a few minutes in the car, the inevitable question would arise: how much longer? Now, Kelly had a stock answer for this, and I even think she inherited this answer from her parents. Instead of trying to explain timing to a cognitively developed, inappropriate age of a child, she would just say the same thing no matter what the timing was. She would just say 5 more miles, 10 more minutes. And because our girls were not so much looking for a technical explanation or answer, but that they were looking for reassurance, this was an appropriate response. Listen, most of us are going to find ourselves not in the driver's seat of life, but in the back seat. And we're strapped in. We don't necessarily know where we're going, and we certainly don't know exactly how long it will take us to be there. But even though we may look more grown up, our childlike questions are still the same, as it says at the beginning of Psalm 13, how long, O Lord? How long must I live in the ambiguity of this diagnosis? How long do I have to live in the uncertainty of this relationship? How long must I suffer from the brokenness of my body or my mind or my spirit? How long must I put up with patience, a loved one that is so hard to love? Our question is one and the same. How long, how long, how long, how long? How long is this something that needs to be endured? How long do I have this ache in my heart? How long do I have this absence within my soul? And what you need to know on the road trip to life is this, is that God's timing isn't always measured in minutes or in miles. It is measured in his perfect wisdom and love for you. And while the waiting that you are called to endure right now feels endless, a journey with God is never, ever wasted. And so as you find yourself strapped in for this life, some of which you did not sign up for, what would it be like for you to be able to go from your cries of lament to being able to trust the one who is behind the wheel and to trust the God who will get you safely to your eternal destination? And so we're going to look at a series of messages that are rooted in the Psalms. And we're going to be able to discover what does it mean for us to be able to dwell with God and to dwell with one another. And as we go through these series of messages, we come to a month where we're curiously exploring the very same questions that the Bible itself raises. And over this month, we're looking at the question, what is man that you are mindful of him? Or how can we sing in the foreign land that Wes preached on last week? And this week, how long? And in order to do that, we're going to look at Psalm 13 as our roadmap. I think of Psalm 13 as like 3 movements in a symphony. And the first movement, the first couple of verses is admit how you feel. Admit how you feel. Let's look at verse 1. How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? 4 different times, in 4 different ways, the same question asked and reiterated, exposing the emotions and the feelings of the heart and the soul. How long, O Lord? How long will I be forgotten? How long will I be unseen? How long will I be filled with sorrow? How long will I feel like I am defeated? We all have the desire, no matter who we are, to be known, to be noticed, seen, loved, and filled with hope and a future. And yet, what David's experiencing in the midst of this is nothing but loss. And so he asks, God, how long am I going to have to put up with this? How long do I got to endure it? There's an author by the name of Susan Cain who wrote a book called Quiet, who helped to bring introversion out into the open. And what she wanted to do in her follow-up book entitled Bittersweet was to do for introverts now what she could do for those who were in the midst of grief. Because you see, one of the things that she uncovered in her research is that in modern day America, we have lost the language of lament. That we're told to put a brave face on, we're told to get over it, we're told to stay true to the power of positive thinking. And yet what she argues is that as psychology has migrated to, in some regards, seeing melancholy as a form of a pathology, that in reality, there's something that's lost when we've forgotten how to grieve, when we've forgotten how to lament, when we try to stuff down the yearnings and the longings of our heart for things that are just broken and untrue and incomplete in your life and in mine. And this is what she writes. Longing yearns for what could have been or what might yet be. But longing is momentum in disguise. It's active, not passive, touched with creative, the tender, and the divine. We long for something or someone. We reach for it, move towards it. This is why in most every children's story you've ever loved, from Harry Potter to Pippi Longstocking, the protagonist is an orphan. In addition to this, you could add every Disney movie that's basically been made. Only once the parents die, transforming into objects of yearning, do the children have their adventures and claim their hidden birthrights. These tales resonate because we're all subject to illness and aging and breakups and bereavement and plagues and wars. And the message of all of these stories, the secret that our poets and our philosophers have been trying to tell us for centuries, is that our longing is the great gateway to belonging. In other words, there's no way to belong to God or to one another without being able to get into the freshness of our yearning and our longing. And that one of the things that we've done is we try to stuff down the feelings. And I don't know about you, but when you pray, do you pray like David does here? Are you like, how long, God? I feel forgotten, I feel forsaken. Or do you gussy up your prayers a little more and make them look a little more like stained glass, where you're telling God what you think he wants to hear? The problem is when you lay before God what is in you, but what you think ought to be in you as opposed to what is actually in you, the real you never actually shows up in your praying. You're never fully present in your prayer. And what we've got to come to terms with is that our longing, our yearning, is not a form of weakness, it's a form of movement. Every therapy appointment that I've ever been a part of, whether it's on the giving end or the receiving end, all unlocks the same gift. It's only in the expression of being able to tell another how you really feel, do you start to begin to have the traction of being able to move beyond the captivity of those feelings or your circumstance? And so if we want to go from our cries of lament to trust, the first thing you're going to have to do is to get honest and vulnerable and admit to God and to others how you actually feel. The second thing we need to do is you need to ask for what you need. Let's look at verse 3. Look on me and answer, Lord my God. Can you start to see the audacity in this ask and the way he approaches God? Then he says, give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. Now, this is a phrase that is probably needing some explanation, but this is actually a quite common idiom in the scripture. This idea of God giving light to your eyes. You are probably familiar at least with the basics of the Job story on how he loses everything. In chapter 17, he says, my eye has also grown dim because of grief. Or how later in the Psalms it says this, my heart throbs, my strength fails me, and the light of my what? My eyes, it also has gone from me. Or also in the Psalm, Psalm 19, it says this, the commands of the Lord are radiant, giving light to the eyes. We say that the eyes are the window to the soul. You've probably seen someone who had really bright eyes and just a sense of kind of aliveness in their eyes, anticipation. And maybe you've also seen somebody who's in the midst of grief or loss, or maybe even towards the end of their life, and there's a dullness to their gaze. Have you come to terms with the fact that in the midst of the darkness, we need to ask God to give us light to our eyes? Jesus picks this up in the famous Sermon on the Mount. He says, if your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. If your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. That if the light that is within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? And in today's fast-paced, modern, technological world, do we even know what it's like to live in darkness anymore? Just a handful of days ago, I was with about 30 people from this church as we were in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt. And our tour guide told us that the lights had gone out in this one particular tomb, so he had all of us pull out our cell phones as we marched into a 3,500-year-old tomb and descended down into the darkness, and you could no longer hear even the wind or the sounds of the entrance. And with our lights, we kept going downward and downward. And then when we got into one of the chambers, he had us turn out all of our lights so that we could experience the darkness for ourselves. And then he yelled something in Arabic, which I don't know what he said, but in my mind it was, let there be light. And somebody flipped the breaker and turned on all the light in the tomb, and you could see the artwork of a people who were attempting to stumble towards eternity. Give light to my eyes, O God, lest I sleep in death. We live in a dark age, in a dark world. And in the light that God provides, have you ever asked him to illumine your day, your family, your work, your life? If we're going to go from our complaint, lament, cries in order to get to trust, if we're going to take this how long prayer seriously, first we need to admit how we really feel. We're also going to have to ask for what we need, and what we need is for God to illumine and give light to our eyes. And then the third thing we need to do is to anchor ourselves in God. Because we have a tendency to anchor ourselves in ourselves. We have a tendency to anchor ourselves in what other people think of us. We have a tendency to anchor ourselves in what we do, our accolades, our success, our accomplishments, or our failures, our inadequacies. This is how we tend to anchor ourselves. And yet, what we discover in this prayer is that we can anchor ourselves in God. Verse 5. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me. Now, pause for a moment. Has his situation changed? Nope. Has his circumstances gotten better? Nope. Is everything okay for him now? Nope. And yet, in the midst of that, he's able to say, I trust you, and I will sing. This is a 4-star Admiral William Bill McCraven. He was the head of special ops for the operation that got Osama bin Laden. He has served this country with incredible distinction, and he has also served as the chancellor for the University of Texas education system. And he tells the story of when he became a Navy SEAL. And maybe you've heard of a little thing called Hell Week that they have to go through. And that the pinnacle of that moment is when they're down in the mud flats between Tijuana and San Diego on the West Coast. And for 24 hours, they are out there in the cold, neck deep into the water and the mud, and that they're put through a variety of challenges and obstacles, and that they have to figure out how to survive and to endure what they are going through. The instructors told them after hours and hours that if only 5 of them will quit, that the rest of them can go back home. He said you could just feel it, that some of them were about ready to throw in the towel. And when they're in the darkest of the hours, and it just feels like that you're so cold and you're so hungry and your body and your strength is failing you and that there's nothing else that you have left to give, that you're at your shattering point, one of his buddies began to sing. It wasn't a particularly good song, but it was a song they all knew. He certainly couldn't sing particularly well, but he sang it with a smile. And when he started to sing, one of his other fellow soldiers started to sing. And they all began to sing together. The instructor started threatening them with extending the time because of the fact that they were singing, and yet they continued to sing. And with about 8 hours left in their endurance, he wrote this: somehow the mud seemed a little warmer, the wind a little tamer, and the dawn not so far away. Imagine if God can use a broken pop song with a really bad voice. Imagine what he could do with our daily dwell this week. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me. When you're neck deep in mud, do you still sing? This is a picture of one of the most famous of archaeological ruins in the Greco-Roman world. This is the city of Ephesus that you read about in your Bibles. This is the great city where Paul spent years. This is the famous image of the library that was there. Here is an image, a picture I took from the top of the theater that's in Ephesus that contains thousands of people. This is the very place that Paul wanted to run into when they wanted to kill them because he wanted to preach the gospel. This is what I refer to as the Broadway theater of Ephesus. And there's another little theater in Upper Ephesus that I refer to as Off-Broadway. It's a smaller theater. It's usually isolated. People usually don't bother going there because they know that the big theater's down at the bottom. So the bottom's more crowded, more public. It was a Sunday morning. It was our only opportunity to worship. I mean, I knew I wanted to read portions of Ephesians. I knew that I wanted to explain some of Paul's life and his ministry in Ephesus before we were going to go look at some of the ruins. But I also knew that as a Christian group that we wanted to sing. We wanted to worship. And so I led us just in a couple of verses of some of those famous hymns that many of us know by heart, like Holy, 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 or Blessed Assurance, Jesus is Mine, or Amazing Grace, How Sweet. Stuff that's super familiar. And we sang. And somebody apparently complained. They didn't complain because of how we sounded. They complained because in the countryside of Turkey, what we were doing is against the statutes. For you see, it's okay for us to teach. It's okay for us to educate. It's okay for us to inform, to explain, to read from the Bible as we tour. You know what's not okay in a public forum today in that place? To worship out loud. And so two soldiers, police officers, I don't know what exactly their rank was, but they had very large guns, came over. And I noticed our tour guide jibber-jabbering back and forth with them. And while I'm reading Paul's letter to the church at Ephesus, she comes over and interrupts me and reminds me, tells me, whatever you do, don't sing anymore. Two words I have never wanted associated with my life are Turkish prison. But was it really all that different for Paul when he was in Ephesus? Do you take for granted what it means to be able to gather in this room and to sing? To sing of the Lord's goodness? To sing of his love? Honestly, for so many people in the world, they would savor the freedom to be in a room like this, to own a campus like this, for us to be able to open our hearts and to do so without fear. That the powers and the principalities of this world know that there's one thing that's really dangerous, and that's worship. And yet we're so blasé about it, and we've forgotten the freedom of what it means to sing. And so it's hard for me to go out into part of the frontier in the mission world where Christians are in such a minority, and to come back and to see the passivity of worship in the American church. Listen, you and I are not in the driver's seat of this journey of life. You live only under the imagination and the illusion that you're controlling where you're headed. Most of the time, we are strapped in the back in a car seat. And we got our questions and we got our doubts. But you know what we also can do in the midst of all of that? We can sing. So don't stop. You have no idea who in this room is about to throw in the towel and needs to hear your broken voice lifted up in worship and in praise because they're neck deep in mud. And all they need is one voice to start the fire of revival within them. And so let's do just that. And let's pray. God, we know and we admit our feelings before you of being forgotten and unseen and filled with heartache and defeat. We're taught in our culture today that we just need to suppress it, we need to avoid it, we need to get over it. Help us to lean into the bittersweet dimension of life and know that our yearning isn't a form of weakness, it is a momentum in your spirit. Help our cries move us greater towards trust. And so, God, we don't measure our words or try to modify our emotions. We just surrender them and throw them and bring them to you and say, how long, how long, how long? And that, God, in the midst of our darkness, that you would give light to our eyes, that our strength is failing us, and yet we believe your ways are radiant, and so help us to be filled with light. And God, even when our circumstances haven't changed, help us to trust, help us to sing. Help us to see beyond the howling wind and the freezing mud. And may we join our voices together to make this world a little warmer and the wind a little tamer and the dawn not so far away. And that we will sing because you have been good to me.